Good afternoon. Welcome to Grand Rounds today. Please, as always, remember to sign the attendance record at the back of the auditorium, and also please remember to fill out the program evaluations and give us any ideas in regards to future topics or future speakers. We're always very appreciative of those. Today, I have the pleasure of actually reintroducing Dr. Douglas Gentile. Dr. Gentile holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota in child psychology, and he's a professor in the Department of Psychology at the, Iowa State University. He's a well-recognized authority in the area of the media influence on adults and children, and we're pleased that he has been able to accept our invitation to provide us with a Grand Rounds review of media violence as a risk factor for aggression. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Douglas Gentile.
Thank you, Dr. Alberg. Well, thank you for having me back here again. You're all sitting way in the back, so what do you think this is, church? Or you've heard I spit. Which is it? Well, thanks for having me back. I've talked somewhat about media violence once or twice before here in Grand Round some years back, but was asked again specifically to go into more of the details this time. So if you've been here before and seen me before, there might be a couple things that'll be familiar, but there is a fair amount of additional detail that we haven't done previously. Now, when we're asking where people learn their attitudes, their values, their patterns of behavior, what's normative and acceptable behavior, there are a number of spheres of influence, especially surrounding children. Certainly the closest into them is the family, and the norms of the family, whatever's acceptable normative behavior, influences all of the individuals in those families. Outside of this level is the level of community, and the norms of community influence the families in it, also influence the individuals. Here's where a community such as Mary Greeley Medical Center matters, that you can influence the families and all the individuals you come into contact with. Outside of this level is society, and the norms of society influence the communities, the families and the individuals in those families, and it's at this level that the media are operating. So the media influence us not just one-on-one when we're watching them, but also by affecting our families, also by affecting our communities. Now, let's see if I can bore you with a little brain science to begin with. This is an oversimplification, but in general, there are three main principles of neural network development that are pretty well established at this time. The first is the use it or lose it principle. The idea is that the neurons that get used more get stronger and get maintained, especially after birth. Every time that baby puts a block in her mouth, different patterns of neurons fire, and that wires up the brain. And neurons are kind of like muscles. The more you use them, the stronger they get. And if you don't use them, they can atrophy, which brings up the second principle, that there are sensitive or critical periods, that the window of opportunity for certain types of behavior, it's not true for all, but for certain types of behavior is only open for so long. So outside of that, though, the brain is plastic, and it's always possible to form a new neural network. Is it possible to learn a new language as an adult? Yes, it is, at least if you're not me. I've been trying to learn Italian. I'm going back to Italy in a month to teach there again, and pretty much all I'm going to be able to say is il mio italiano è molto male. My Italian really sucks. Unless the conversation is, how much does that cost? No, that's too much. I can't hold a conversation in Italian. So my students are going to have to listen in English, which I've done before, and they're actually much better at that than I am listening to them in Italian. But brain science says I should be able to learn Italian. So you've probably seen this slide in your textbooks at some point, that baby brains at 1 month, lots of neurons here, but they're not well connected. As time goes on, they send out more and more interconnections. If we look farther across time, at birth, again, lots of neurons. By age 6, it's a dense forest of interconnection, and by adulthood, that forest has actually been pruned back some. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. The best guess right now in that pruning is this pruning starts happening at adolescence. This might be why adolescent thought is different from middle childhood thought, actually. Adolescents can do abstract thinking. Younger children can't. We think this might actually be part of why. Because what do you have here? Lots and lots of redundant pathways. What do you have here? Just the best ones. So neural network development is use-dependent. The neurons that get used make more interconnections, get stronger, get kept. The ones that don't get stripped out of the brain. And you've been lied to. The lie is the birth to 3 movement. What's the lie? 3. Yes, birth to 3 matters for brain development. And it doesn't stop at 3. In fact, if you use the brain's consumption of glucose as an indication of how much it's building itself, it continues to go up and up and up to about age 7, where it levels off and only starts to decline in adolescence. So neural network development is happening for a much longer period than just the birth to 3 period, and it's important not just for things that we think of as being underlain by neural networks like critical thinking and reading and language and math skills and problem-solving skills and things like that, but it's also important for things like your attitudes, your values. We tend to talk about attitudes as if they're not part of your brain, but they must be, right? There's nothing you can do as a human that isn't part of your brain. So the conclusion I draw is that children's experiences are a major factor determining their attitudes, their values, and their patterns of behavior. Now, if you buy this conclusion, then there's a fair question to ask. Well, what experiences are kids having? Well, children today spend more time in front of electronic screens than any other thing except sleeping, and they're actually encroaching on sleeping now, having more time with screens than even sleeping. So therefore, TV and video games must have an influence on brain development just because that's how the brain works. Whatever you do is more practice for your brain. Now, before we get into talking about aggression, I want you to recall that the obesity epidemic, in some respects, is very simple. It's a simple equation. If the energy you take in is more than the energy you use, you're going to gain weight. Does that make it an easy problem to solve? Well, here's what we need to pay attention to if we wanted to actually have a good solution for the obesity epidemic. Just because we know why it works does not make it an easy problem. And in here we've got family things and food things and media things and community things, and all this goes into energy balance, right? Similarly, aggression is multi-causal. So what do we mean by aggression? Well, aggression is properly defined as any behavior. So that could be a verbal behavior, that could be a physical behavior, that could be a relational behavior that is intended to harm another person, and that person would rather not be harmed. This is a nice, clean definition. Most sports, not aggression. Accidents, not aggression. Acts of God, not aggression. Sadomasochism, not aggression, because then the victim wants it. It's actually a good, clean definition. Now, when you hear the rhetoric around media violence and aggression, you'll notice they almost never use the word aggression. They use the word violence. And that's a very specific rhetorical trick they're playing on you. What is violence? Violence is a subtype of aggression. First of all, it's physical only. And second of all, it's extreme, such that if successful, it would cause severe bodily damage or death. So when people talk about media violence, there's lots and lots of research, we'll go through a little bit of it today, on media violence is a causal risk factor for aggression. That doesn't mean necessarily it's the same causal risk factor for violence, because now we've made it a very extreme behavior. Now, this definition could be applied to the media. Here are kind of the poster children bad boys of the video game world, Grand Theft Auto and Manhunt, but it would also count for these types of games. This one, you're a cute little robot in a happy, colorful place. The music is sweet and bouncy. You've got your little ray gun. You go around and shoot things. They certainly don't bleed, and they don't scream in pain, and they don't beg for their lives. They just disappear. But if you could imagine the motivations of the other characters, they would rather not have been made to disappear, so this would count as aggression under the proper definition of aggression. Now, this is one of the most studied things in psychology. There are hundreds upon hundreds of high-quality studies since the 1960s. We know the answer. There are 19 scientifically documented effects of media violence. They can be grouped into 4 pretty well. The first is the aggressor effect. Simply put, the more entertainment violence you watch, generally, it seems to be related to increased aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, more willing to behave aggressively when provoked. The second effect is the victim effect, that the more entertainment violence you watch, the more scared you get. It's sometimes called the mean world syndrome. You start seeing the world as a more scary place than it really is. You overestimate your risk of getting attacked. Kids initiated more self-protective behavior, like carrying guns to school, which ironically increases their odds of getting shot. The third effect is the bystander effect, where the more we watch, the more desensitized we become. Now, I don't just mean desensitized to other media violence, although that's true. It also desensitizes us to aggression in the real world. The classic study of this, they brought college-age men into a lab. They had them watch, they randomly assigned, I think it was either 20 minutes of a sports program or 20 minutes of a movie that included a simulated rape scene. And then they brought in a real woman who had really been raped. And the men who saw the movie with the simulated rape scene were much more callous toward her, much more apathetic, much less empathetic to her real human suffering and pain. 20 minutes changed the way they interacted with another human being. That scares me. And the fourth effect is the appetite effect. Simply put, the more you watch, the more you want to. There is basically no serious debate in scientific psychology around these issues. The issue is not, is there an effect? The issue is, what type of effect is what type of kid going to get more? In general, boys get more the aggressor, bystander, and appetite. Girls get more the victim. But everyone is influenced in some way. Here's the Hollywood executive. These kids gunning down other kids in their schools could desensitize people to some of our movies. Now, what about the flip side? What if you're watching positive, pro-social shows where people care about each other's feelings, take care of each other, show empathy towards each other? It turns out there are two main effects of this type of programming. First is a pro-social effect, where kids exhibit more helpful and cooperative behaviors in the real world, and they show lower aggressive behaviors in the real world. Now, what if you mix these two together? Say like superheroes, who, let's pick one, Batman. Batman does violent things for pro-social ends. Well, for young kids, by which I mean up to about age 7 or 8, if you show them shows with only pro-social acts, and then you turn them loose in a room with other kids, and you just count their behaviors. How many helpful behaviors, how many hurtful behaviors do? They exhibit more helpful behaviors than harmful ones. That makes sense, right? If you show them shows with only aggressive acts and then turn them loose and count their behaviors, they show about equal numbers of helpful and harmful behaviors. If, however, you show them shows with both aggressive and pro-social acts, then they exhibit more hurtful behaviors than helpful ones. Why? Well, this is a complicated mixed message we're giving kids. Let me break it down as simply as it can be. Here's the simplest you can make Batman. We socially sanction Batman's limited act of aggression on this alleged criminal perpetrator, because by removing the alleged criminal perpetrator from society, we reduce a greater number of aggressive acts either across time or across people, and so that's why we socially sanction Batman's limited act of vigilante aggression. That's the simplest it gets. Little kids can't do that. Little kids understand Batman is good, Batman hits people. Therefore, hitting people is good if you're the good guy. And we all think we're the good guys, right? September 11th terrorists thought they were the good guys too. Now, once you get to about age 8, kids start being able to understand this mixed message. But this shows an important place where parents and caregivers make a basic mistake. We look at these shows with our advanced cognitive powers, and we say, oh, it's a nice story. At the end, justice is served, the bad guy goes to jail. Little kids can't understand that. Little kids do not understand the plot. There are great studies. You take these shows, you chop them up and randomly reorder them. Kids can't tell the difference. They have no idea how the beginning of the show relates to the middle, relates to the end, and they certainly cannot do that cognitively complex thing you do, where you rewrap things you learned earlier by things you learned later, such as how the moral relates to what happened before. Little kids cannot. Even if you're sitting there explaining it to them, they cannot understand that. And we choose to let them see things because we understand it, And we forget what it was like to be a little kid. So what do they actually learn? If the show has 28 minutes of fighting and 2 minutes of, oh, maybe it was bad, they learn at a ratio of 28 to 2 that fighting is exciting. Where's our sound? This was working earlier. Sound.
Bob's Daycare Center. About 10 kids, mostly 2 to 5 years old. And over 2 days, we watched them watch us.
Can you see okay?
We wanted to see if different kinds of programs would get kids to act in different kinds of ways. We had the room rigged, so while they were watching the monitor was watching them. We had cameras in plants, toy boxes, and on the other side of that one-way mirror over there. All of these cameras sent pictures to TV screens upstairs, where we sat with their parents and David Walsh, a psychologist who also runs the National Institute for Media and the Family.
It's at the age that these kids are that they're like sponges. They're learning constantly. All day long, they're learning.
On the first day, we had the kids watch Barney.
Hi, everybody.
The popular public television program with the big purple dinosaur.
Are you ready for the next letter?
The target 2 to 5 age group is drawn in near completely. They sing the songs. We found them literally marching to the beat of this drummer.
Let's go march around the circle.
When those kids started dancing, most of the kids in the group jumped to their feet and started directly imitating what they were doing, what they were seeing.
Teresa's daughter, Hannah, is one way over the top about Barney.
She knows all their names. It's kind of like she
It's
gets to
almost
know
like she
them.
becomes part of that.
She becomes part of the group. Yes.
Yeah.
The kids carry the themes over after the show, playing together peacefully.
I'm proud of the way they're acting.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, I think they're acting being good. They're behaving well. Oh, just wait till you see.
On day 2, it's the Power Rangers. The popular teeny bopper superheroes doing good by beating the living daylights out of anyone doing bad. Starts out calm, even scaring some of the kids into the corner at first. But within minutes, it's become something else altogether.
I'm boy. I'm Tommy.
The kids want to be like the Power Rangers so much, they start early, taking dibs on which one best represents them. You might expect kids to act differently, given these 2 shows, but would you really expect this?
You're going to hurt each other. You better watch what you're doing.
Early on in the show, before all of the action scenes started, they were sitting in a circle, really paying attention. And once the sustained fighting started, that circle is pretty much completely disintegrated.
Oh my goodness. I thought my son was afraid of this movie, and now he's doing the action figure motions.
Remember, here are the kids with Barney, and here are the kids with the Power Rangers.
Actually, it's more than what I expected from the other kids, but my daughter is what I expected. She's really not, she's not responding at all.
Teresa knows her daughter. She's quite suspicious about the suggestion a simple one-time exposure to a TV program could seriously influence the child she knows so well. But she found out she just had to wait a little longer.
She just kicked Katie. I'm really shocked.
And that's
It's the
kind of a
first
shock
time
to
I've
you.
ever seen that.
That sweet little Hannah was within minutes.
My scared little Hannah. You know.
I'm shocked. I knew that they would get up and be active, but I had no idea it was going to be like this. No idea.
This is not my child today. He's not my child.
For some of the parents here, this is not so much eye-opening as it is flat-out disturbing.
How are you going to get rug burn on your face again?
I just feel very nervous that he's reacting this way and that he can react this way so easily to something that he's seen for 20 minutes.
David Walsh argues these kinds of scenes are proof positive that kids learn from television.
There are studies that show that babies as young as 14 months old will imitate what they see on a television screen. You know, so it starts early.
Just don't seem as content as they were yesterday.
Just not respecting each other.
The thing that we need to remember as parents is that even though the goal isn't to teach, our kids are learning because they're always learning.
The thing that fascinates me the most here is little Hannah. Why did little Hannah start punching and kicking? Did TV make little Hannah start punching and kicking? No? Okay, fair enough. What did? Her friends, the other kids. Okay. What made the other kids start punching and kicking? TV. This is one of the rare opportunities you get to see the multiple layers of the effect happening. For most of the kids, it was a simple, direct, one-to-one thing. They saw it, they started copying it. But not little Hannah. What influenced her was her community changed. One day, what was acceptable normative behavior in the room was sharing, caring, polite, respectful behavior. The next day was punching, kicking, aggressive play. What changed the norm? Television. And that was powerful enough to bring everyone along with it. Now, this also teaches us something about the nature of peer pressure. Because we often ask questions about, kids, why do kids smoke? And we go, peer pressure. And we stand back smugly as if we've said something important. That doesn't answer the question at all. Where did the peers learn it, is the question you need to ask. Because I promise you, no peer came up with the idea of growing tobacco, drying it, processing, infusing with chemicals, chopping it up, wrapping it in paper, lighting it on fire, inhaling the smoke and thinking that's cool. Where did the peers get the idea it would be cool? And many times when you ask that question, you're back to the media. So from now on, anytime you hear yourself utter the words peer pressure, I want you to kick yourself and go one step farther. Where did the peers get it? So the U.S. Surgeon General reported to Congress, it's clear to me the causal relationship, the C word, causal relationship between televised violence and antisocial behavior is sufficient to warrant appropriate and immediate remedial action. There comes a time when the data are sufficient to justify action. That time has come. Most of you aren't old enough to remember this, your Surgeon General. 1972. We have known for a long time. And yet you think it's an open question. You think we don't really know yet. Wait, why would that be? Well, where do you get your information? Oh yeah, the same place. The same companies that feed you the media violence. Funny. Now you might say, is it aggressive kids seek out media violence, or is it media violence makes kids aggressive? Classic 22-year longitudinal study done by Raoul Huseman and his colleagues started with kids at age 8, measured how aggressive they were by peer report in their classrooms, and also measured how much violent TV they watched, and found that, yes, the kids who watched more violent TV at age 8 were also the most aggressive kids. Now, that doesn't answer the question. You follow them out to 19, and it turns out the boys who had watched the most violent TV at age 8 were the most aggressive at age 19. But being violent at age 8 did not predict the amount of violent TV they watched at 19. So it looks like the direction only goes in one way. When they follow them out to age 30, the boys who had watched the most violent TV at age 8 were now incarcerated for aggressive crimes by age 30. Now, there are a lot of useful parallels to think about between smoking and lung cancer. Because you're going to hear a lot of these arguments. If you try to talk to your patients and families, they're going to say, well, no, I play these violent video games and I never shot anyone. Well, not everyone who smokes gets lung cancer, and not everyone who gets lung cancer is a smoker. That doesn't mean it's not a causal risk agent. Smoking is not the only factor that causes lung cancer, but it's an important one. And the first cigarette often is not a pleasant experience. And yet, as you continue practicing, you desensitize yourself to it and then start craving it. And this is very similar. If you watch a 4-year-old's face when something violent comes on the TV, he's not liking it. But you sit there and watch enough of it, and he'll learn to like it. And violent media are not the only risk factor for aggression, but that doesn't mean they're not an important one. The short-term effects of one cigarette wear off pretty quickly and are fairly innocuous. Similarly, any one show, any one game, any one session, any one movie is not going to make that big a difference. But the long-term cumulative effects can be severe. And the sixth parallel is that in the long fight between science and the tobacco industry, there was big money on one side of that fight. And that led them to buy off scientists and deny publicly that, as recently as 1994, I don't know if you remember this, but the heads of all the major tobacco companies were sitting in front of Congress, raising their hands and swearing under oath that there was no evidence that smoking was related to cancer, as recently as 1994. And by that point, no one believed them anymore, and they basically got booed off the stage. But they kept trying as long as they could. And similarly, you're not hearing the truth about the science through the media, because they're the ones who control what gets out there. If we look at news reports since the 1950s, these were all coded. A zero would mean the news or magazine said that there's no relation between media violence and aggression. At 5, it says, well, parents probably should discourage their kids from viewing it. 10 would mean they're saying that media violence is a direct causal influence. And as you see, the evidence actually wasn't zero. Even this is before there were any studies. They weren't saying zero. But as the evidence grew, it went up, and then it started to decline. Here's the actual strength of the scientific evidence. It's been getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Here's where you put them together. As the evidence has gotten stronger, the media are actually going backwards, telling you there's no consensus. Oh, we're just trying to create a moral panic. That's one of the catchphrases these days. Do I seem panicky? Here's a group of people you probably are in some of those associations. The important words are there. Strong consensus, causal, between media violence and aggression. This was a joint statement released on the White House lawn. And how many of you heard of this? Yeah, none. How many of you remember the Firestone tires blowing out on Ford Explorers? That was another news story. That one killed a couple people, and yet that was national news everywhere, and you remember that. That was the news story happening at the same time as this, yet this one didn't get reported on the news, even though it was reported on the White House lawn. I'm going to skip that, but I'll tell you what happened in it. I got to help Super Nanny here design a little pseudo-experiment. We had 40 kids. We had half of them playing a violent war game, half of them playing a soccer game, which she'll talk about as football. I'll show you another clip. We had them wired up to heart rate sensors. And after playing for about 20, 30 minutes, I forget exactly what the number is, we then showed them actual violent clips from the news footage. And the kids who had been playing the war game, their heart rate did not go up. The kids who had been playing the soccer game, they had a big reaction. So just playing the game for 20 minutes desensitized them to real world violence. Here is the scariest study I know, done by my colleague Brad Bushman. He had 52 pairs he had kids come in and bring a friend. All right, so these are friend pairs. They come into the lab, and they are randomly assigned to watch clips from one of 2 movies, and then within that, the clips either had guns in them and some shooting, or they didn't, but they're still clips from exactly the same movies. And then they turned them loose in a room with lots of toys. But also in the room was a real gun. Now, the firing pin had been removed, and there were no bullets. There was no ammunition. But it was hidden in a drawer. And so there are several questions. Will the kids find it? If they find it, what will they do? Will they call an adult like they've all been trained they're supposed to do? Will they touch it, which they've all been trained they shouldn't do? Will they pick it up, which they shouldn't do? If they do pick it up, how long will they hold it? What will they do with it if they pick it up? So here's the room, and it's down in that drawer. And it turns out that 72% found the gun in the room. And of these, only 16 of them went and told the researcher. 27 of them did nothing, and 32 of them picked up the gun. What did they do with the gun? How did they hold the gun? Well, in terms of how long they held it, It was only 11 seconds if they had been watching a movie clip with no guns, and 5 times that if they had watched a clip with guns. But the real upsetting thing is if they'd watched the movies with guns, they pointed it at their friend and pulled the trigger. This is their friend. It's a real gun. It's not a toy. They can tell. It's heavy. Now, this is my favorite study I've done because this explains how the effect actually happens. So this is 3,000 kids followed for 3 years. And the eye, these are longitudinal latent growth curves. The eye is the intercept. Where did they start at the beginning of the study? The S is the slope. How did they change over the time of the study? This is how much they were consuming violent video games. And down here we have aggressive cognition. We measured 3 types of aggressive cognition. The first is called hostile attribution bias. Now, you all know people who, when something annoying happens, they give the other person the benefit of the doubt. They assume it was an accident, right? We also know people who take everything very personally. This is more like that second one, where you have a bias for attributing hostility to other people's actions. You think they meant to do it. They meant to make you mad. And of course, the whole time you're playing a violent video game, you're practicing this. You're expecting things to jump out at you. You're being hyper vigilant for aggression to happen. So you're actually practicing a hostile attribution bias when you're playing a violent video game. The second type of aggressive cognition is called normative beliefs about aggression. This is how acceptable it is to behave aggressively when provoked. And again, we all know people who say you should never hit back, and we also know people who say you should hit back harder, right? This is more like that second one. And of course, the entire time you're playing a violent video game, you're getting rewarded for behaving aggressively when provoked. You, in fact, are often punished if you don't respond aggressively when provoked. The third effect, or the third cognition, is aggressive fantasies. This is just how much time you spend thinking about how you would like to hurt other people. And of course, the entire time you're playing a violent video game, you are rehearsing aggressive fantasies. So what we see is that kids who start off the study playing more violent video games also start off with more of all 3 types of these aggressive cognitions. If they change to play more violent video games, they change to have more of these 3 types of aggressive cognitions. Why does aggressive cognition matter? Because what you think can leak out into your behavior. And that's what we see, is that as kids have more aggressive cognitions, they end up being more physically aggressive in the real world. There's also this extra kick, even long-term effect, that just playing violent video games at all seems to increase your risk of physical aggression 2 years later. Now, why I like this study is it tells you the truth about the effect. Let's imagine this kid who's been spending a lot of time playing a lot of violent video games. He's in school, he's in the hallway, he gets bumped by another kid. Well, because he's been spending all this time playing these games, he stops assuming it was an accident. He starts assuming the other kid meant to do it. Now, another thing you do in these games is as soon as you see an aggressive stimulus, you quickly reorient your attention to focus on it. And so this kid is also going to turn to look at the kid who just bumped him, right? Now, he's going to call to mind, how should he react? What would a reasonable response be? Well, the thing humans do, especially when under pressure, is the thing you've practiced the most. It's called the availability heuristic, if you're keeping track on your lucky psychology jargon scorecards. And so the thing you've practiced the most, if you've played a lot of violent video games, is an aggressive response to an aggressive stimulus. So that's what's going to come to mind. He should say something unkind back or push back or something like that, right? But even that's not enough to get you to do it. Just because you think it isn't enough to do it. But because he's been reinforced and rewarded thousands and thousands of times playing these games, that lowers the bar, making it much more likely that he will say something unkind or push back. Now, if he does that, the odds of this turning into a full-blown fight skyrocket. But it's just that tiny little change of the way you see the world that starts this whole cascade. That tiny little shift in perception from seeing annoying things as being accidental to being intentional changes all the odds downstream. And if that fight breaks out in the school hallway, here's the interesting thing. It looks nothing like what they were playing in games. Kids aren't copying. That's not how the effect works. It changes the way you see the world and the way you think. And you take the way you see the world and think with you everywhere. And it just subtly shifts the odds so that you're more likely to get involved in aggressive encounters. Now, you haven't heard that story through the media, but that's the truth of how it works. It's not kids, school shootings being copycats. There are a couple that are copycats, but that's not really how this effect works. It shifts what you see as normal and acceptable and the way you see your place in the world.
The boys are still in two groups. 20 are playing a violent war game, and the other 20 a non-violent football game.
So all these boys are playing their video games. Doug's in a room about to interview some of those kids, and I want to sneak around there and take a look myself.
Joe will observe while Doug interviews a random sample from each group.
So we've got Doug sitting down already.
Each boy will be asked a series of questions. During the interview, Doug will intentionally knock a couple of pens over to see how the players respond. Will the violent players react in the same way as the non-violent players? The first candidate for interview is one of the non-violent football gamers.
I'm Doug. Have a seat. Just have a couple questions for you right now, and then we might talk to you again a little bit later on. But do you play games at your home?
Yeah.
Yeah? What game systems do you have?
Just PS2.
And what would you say are your 3 favorite games? Sure.
Doug's theory is that the non-violent gamers will help, but the violent gamers won't. Joe is not so sure.
So when Doug went to go and pick him up, then the politeness kicked in and he said, "Oh, do you want a hand?" There wasn't an immediate reaction. And I think purely that was because he's a polite boy. I don't think it was because he played football. I'm not quite convinced yet.
So what happens with a boy who played the violent war game?
What are your 3 very favorites?
Call of Duty World at War.
Mm-hmm.
And another.
And what would you say are your 3 very favorite games? Oh, well, either. Just 3 favorite to play.
And another violent gamer.
Very favorite game.
Call of Duty.
He didn't even budge. He looked.
All 3 violent gamers have not offered to help. But what about a non-violent game player?
To play.
Nice.
And another.
And what would you say are your 3 favorite games?
Pick 'em up.
So far, all 4 non-violent gamers have volunteered to pick up the pens. But what if we go back to the violent gamers?
Actually, I think he gave less a reaction than anyone I've seen.
Overall, only 40% of the violent gamers picked up the pens. But an incredible 80% of the non-violent gamers all stepped in to help Doug. It's a simple and revealing test with shocking results.
So the important question is facial hair or no facial hair? Should I grow it back? I'm sorry, I can't grow that back. But I could grow the goatee back. What is important to me about this is the real effect. It changed the way they saw the world. It's not that these kids were all of a sudden shooters because they'd played a shooter game. They didn't even see an opportunity to help when there was one. It didn't even occur to them to help because they were so used to not being helpful. That's what they'd been practicing in the game, is harming rather than helping. And that just subtly shifts the way you see the world, and that tiny shift in perception shifts the odds downstream. Now, there are lots of different meta-analyses, studies of studies. I'm not going to bore you with all these numbers. I just want you to notice that if we look here at the aggressive behavior, these are effect sizes in correlation terms. Again, if you're keeping track in your Lucky Psych scorecards. Sherry and Ferguson all claim there is no effect of media violence on aggression. And yet their numbers are almost the same as the researchers who say these data make it clear there is an effect. So that's odd, because almost all the meta-analyses, even among the critics, find the exact same thing. But yet they claim there's no effect at all. And when they say pretty extreme things like, it's been thoroughly refuted in the scientific literature, it's an urban legend. But even when they say that there is an effect on thoughts and feelings. But wait a minute, your thoughts and feelings relate to your behavior. So the critical view or the extreme critical view doesn't even make a whole lot of sense, because they say, oh yeah, violent movies and games, etc., can influence your thoughts and feelings, but there's no way it can influence your behavior. It doesn't make a bit of sense to me. Now, what if we compare it with other risk factors? So this is a study, a short-term longitudinal study across the school year with, if I recall, 400 and some third through fifth graders. And we measured several risk factors for aggression. Having a hostile attribution bias, we've talked about that. And if you have a high hostile attribution bias, yes, you are more likely to have gotten into physical fights by the end of the school year. If your parents are not involved, then you're more likely to get in fights. If you have a preference for violent video games, if you've been bullied, if you're a boy, if you consume a lot of media violence, and if you've been involved in fights previously, that's always the best predictor of future aggression, is past aggression. What do you notice about this? Well, media violence actually isn't the biggest risk in terms of how much it changes it. This is. It acts like other risk factors. And in other analyses that I'm not showing you now, but I can send you papers if you want, when you reduce that risk, the risk of aggression goes down. When we put them all together, to explain who's getting into fights by the end of the school year, the number one predictor is whether you've been involved in fights previously. The next are kind of a tied, whether you've been bullied and whether you consume a lot of media violence. And so it's not the biggest risk factor out there. What seems to matter more, though, is not whether you have a risk factor or don't. It's how many risk factors you have. So if kids have zero risk of these risk factors, they're at low risk for getting into a physical fight in the next year. If they have one or two, it almost doesn't change the risk. You get to 3 and it does seem to change it pretty much. You get out to 4 of these risk factors and there are now over 50-50 odds of getting into a fight. We have all 7 of them, and I have 94% accuracy predicting which kids are going to get into a fight in the next year. I'll say that again. Just knowing these 7 things, I can predict with 94% accuracy which kids are going to get into a physical fight. I can't tell you which day. If I actually only know 3 things, are you a boy? Do you consume a lot of media violence? And have you been involved in fights in the past? That's 80% accuracy. So how should we think about media violence? Well, I tend to think about it in relation to this metaphorical aggression thermometer. Down here at the cold end, kids are always respectful and polite. I'm sure that's your kids. And as it heats up, maybe they show some rude behaviors or thoughtless behaviors. And then they might have some aggressive thoughts, and then they might actually saying aggressive things or rude things, and then they might start behaving relationally aggressive, doing things like, I'm having a party and you're not invited. Those types of, which we think of as more typically feminine style aggression, although boys do it about as much actually as girls do. Then as it gets pretty hot, then they start having violent thoughts or fantasies. And then pushing and shoving. And only at the most extreme do you do anything like hitting or doing potentially lethal violence. No one is saying media violence can take a kid from the bottom and push them all the way top. It might move you 1 or 2 notches. So if we take the killers at Columbine High School, those kids had uninvolved parents. Those kids had psychiatric illnesses. Those kids had easy access to weapons. Those kids consumed a lot of media violence. Is that the thing that pushed them over the top? No. But it did increase the risk. And if you'd taken it away, it would have decreased the risk. If I'm right that media violence is heating it up, where would we see the effect? we wouldn't see it necessarily in school shootings because those are actually still really rare. So these are data from one of the big school shooter years. In that year, there were 35 deaths in schools. As horrifying as that number is, it's only the tip of the iceberg. That same year, there were 250,000 times we got the kid to the hospital on time. He didn't die. 1 million thefts or larcenies, 1.5 million reported fights, and 18 million incidents of bullying. If I'm right that it's heating it up, where will we see the effect? We'll see it in the lower level aggressive behaviors. But we never think about looking there. We only talk about school shootings, which is the wrong time to talk about it, because to do something that extreme means you have a lot of risk factors, not any one. So the conclusion I draw is that media violence is somehow achieved what seems to be a special status where people want to say, oh, think of the children. Or they want to say, oh, there's no effect at all. You want to go to one extreme or the other. But you know what? It acts just like every other risk factor out there. When it's present, the odds go up. When it's absent, the odds go down. It doesn't deserve either special concern or special denial. And you, as medical professionals, are used to thinking in this way of multiple causes. What causes obesity? Even though it's a simple equation, it's not a simple answer. It has lots of things coming together. This isn't surprising. This shouldn't be new news to you, really. We've known for 2,600 years that what you practice, you get better at. If you spend a lot of time practicing aggressive ways of thinking and seeing the world and responding, even if it's in a game, even though it's just a game, even if it's a movie, you get better at it. It's not brain science. Oh, wait, yes, it is. Your grandmother was a great neuroscientist. She told you practice makes perfect. She was right. Now, I'll end with my favorite study I've ever done. This is 1,400 kids. We talked to the kids, we talked to their parents, we talked to the school teachers, we talked to the school nurses. We got a lot of information about these kids. We tracked them across the school year. And what we find is that if parents are setting more limits on the amount and content of children's screen media at the beginning of the year, those kids are consuming less screen time and less violent screen media. By the end of the school year, that predicts that those kids are getting more sleep, which in turn lowered their weight gain, so their risk for obesity. They were getting better grades in school. They were more pro-social in their behaviors towards other kids, as rated by teachers, which is remarkable because the teachers don't know what the family rules for media are, and yet they can see the behaviors. And they were less aggressive, again, as rated by teachers. Now, there are two things that fascinate me about this. The first is those are not the same type of outcome variable. That's physical health, school performance, and social wellness. Those three types of things don't usually co-occur like this. But this one simple thing of setting limits on amount and content of media influences all of them. So it's a ripple effect that extends outward in time and across a wide range of health and wellness indicators. But the more interesting thing to me is that no parent will ever know they're having this effect. Because you can't know your child gained less weight than he would have. You can't know that your child's getting better grades than she would have gotten, or was more pro-social than he would have been. You only know what your kid is. And this is why parents feel powerless. Because what they can see is the fight over the rules. They can't see the effect they're actually having. But parents are in a much more powerful position than they realize. And if you get this information to parents, they will start realizing it's worth having the fight. It's worth holding the line because it has a huge effect, a huge protective factor effect across a wide range of health and wellness indicators. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Your second to the last slide, what was the parental monitoring? What really was going on there?
Okay, so how detailed an answer do you want?
I assume you had a control group.
No, this is just following this. This is based on what parents report. The parents who say they have more rules for media use, and the rules could be on time, how much time they're allowed, or it could be when they're allowed to watch it. It could be what types of shows they were allowed to watch, whether the parents used the ratings. It was a number of indicators about restrictive monitoring, either on amount or on content. And the parents who reported that they did more of this in October, by May, we saw these effects.
Okay.
Thank you all. Please get this information to the people you work with.